From WNPR, I'm John Dankosky, and this is The Wheelhouse.
This will be the largest audience to witness an Emmys, period.
CNN has learned that investigators wiretapped former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort.
In the streets of Mexico tonight, panic and pandemonium. The major earthquake, a 7.1, shook central Mexico shortly after 2:10 p.m. Eastern Time.
Puerto Rico's governor is warning a direct hit from Maria may cause a total collapse of the energy system.
Senate Republicans continue to push legislation replacing the Affordable Care Act. It would get rid of protections for people with pre-existing conditions and reduce Medicaid grant money.
The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself.
He called him Rocket Man. You can join the conversation, 860-275-7266. Comment at our website, wnpr.org/The Wheelhouse. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. Colin McEnroe is abroad. He has left the country temporarily. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe he's staying there. But we're joined today by Bill Curry, who is ably filling in for him. He's our Democratic political analyst. Hello there, Bill.
Morning, sir. Great to be here.
Wait a minute. Damn it. Somebody's got to say it. Playing the role of Colin McEnroe today is Bill Curry.
It is Colin himself has said it's the role of a lifetime.
It's the role of a lifetime.
So I couldn't be more honored. Really, this is a very special. Is this what meta means?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, I have been wondering for years about that.
This is very meta.
Yeah, thank you.
The master of meta, Mark Pazniokis, Capitol Bureau Chief at the Connecticut Mirror. Hello, Paz. Good to see you.
Good morning.
And Christine Stewart, Editor-in-Chief of CTNewsJunkie.com. Hello, Christine.
Good morning, John.
As I said at the top of the program in our introduction, we were planning to spend the entire hour with our Capitol insiders talking about the state of the state budget and some of the dramatics that happened over the course of this last weekend and what's happening next. And we will. That's going to be the bulk of our show. But I don't know, Bill, when the President of the United States speaks in front of the United Nations and vows to totally destroy North Korea if it threatens the United States, it seems as though that might be the lead of almost any program as we talk about everything from health care and an Obamacare repeal that's going through the Congress this week, as we think about how the stock market's doing or how states might meet their budgetary obligations. The specter of nuclear war is one that I think hangs over us in a way that maybe we've gotten a little too used to in 2017.
In an alternate universe, for instance, the one we were living in until just last November, a president of the United States going to the United Nations and not only threatening nuclear war, threatening to destroy the entire population of a country, the most grotesque violation of international law I've ever heard suggested by a head of state in my lifetime. Going to the United Nations and taunting while doing it a foreign leader who has nuclear weapons, who's clearly emotionally imbalanced. To say that would be the story of the month is an understatement. And as Paz and we were all joking before, Trump has so normalized the abnormal that it competes for news space. An American president threatening all-out, utter nuclear destruction of a country that hasn't attacked us before the United Nations almost passes for normal. If I can just say add two things to it. One, when Trump was running, he said, America's a laughingstock. No one respects us. All the polls said that Obama had brought us to the highest level of public support across the globe since Clinton, and one of the highest ever. Our relations with other states were great. Now America really is like the drunk at the end of the bar that nobody wants to make eye contact with for fear of setting off a brawl. And the leadership we've lost in the Paris Climate Accords, with the Iran treaty with our allies, with the trade deal in the Pacific, the United States is in full retreat from the world and stumbling and falling as it goes. And it would be a laughingstock, except that at this point, no one's laughing. This is a national security disaster for the United States. If I can make one other point, that is that I wish on the Democratic side, or the Republican side for that matter, that someone would stand up and say, our goal right now, our national security, we are moving into a multilateral world. This idea of America, the sole superpower, that's been dead for a decade. We're moving into a world in which our security depends upon the rule of law. Our security depends upon persuading other people not to threaten violence to get their way or to use it. Our security depends on strengthening all of these ties. And in fact, we are moving in exactly the opposite direction. We are a much weaker country today because of this, and endangered.
Well, and Paz, I wonder, as we try to put all this in context of all the other things that are happening in another news week that seems to be crammed with things. I mean, as we speak right now, a second hurricane is ripping through U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, threatening many, many millions of people, including thousands of whom have ties directly to Connecticut. And we certainly wish everyone well. There's almost too much to talk about. But this overlay of something that I think, as Bill rightly put, would have been the biggest news of any given year, sitting on top of it, it almost seems like an afterthought. It's just one of many things we can chat about this morning.
It's like a bad TV movie with plot twists that just are beyond belief. But, I had two thoughts on Trump's speech. It was about two very different people. Honest to God, I thought of Steve Bannon, who made the point before his ceremonious departure from the White House that if anybody who talks about military action against North Korea needs to explain how, 10 million South Koreans don't die in the first half hour, not from a nuclear conflagration, but from the conventional artillery that is aimed at Seoul, which is, as
about half a block away.
Yeah. And the other person I thought of was Stanislav Petrov, the Soviet officer who in 1983, and shortly after the Soviets shooting down Korean Airlines airliner, his instruments recorded 5 ICBMs streaking towards Moscow from the United States. And instead of alerting his superiors to an attack by the United States, he took it upon himself to say there's a malfunction in the system. And that was his report. And of course, he was correct. So the question is there a Stanislav Petrov at NORAD in Washington or in North Korea, for that matter?
Mr. Petrov passed away this week at the age of 77.
And weirdly, yes, and weirdly, news of his death surfaced now. If you believe in signs, there it is.
Christine?
Well, I just think it's interesting that I feel like Trump's speech, I feel like over the past decades, we have viewed the president of the United States as the leader of the free world. And
that would be Angela
now,
Merkel.
Right. Well, yeah. And so I don't think that Trump views himself that way. He views himself as the president of the United States, and it doesn't expand beyond that, beyond those borders. And so it's kind of a constrained view of this office.
It's a constrained view of the office, and this is not in defense, Bill, but I think it is fair to say that Donald Trump is the only recent American president who certainly ran purely on an America First platform. Ronald Reagan famously said those exact same words, but then also spent quite a bit of time talking about how the United States was meant to export democracy around the world. That was another part of Reagan's message. Donald Trump has said America first. He was also speaking in front of a body that he and many millions of Americans who voted for him find to be toothless and ineffective. He's trying, I think, to make a point through this crude language that the United Nations is not necessarily a helper to the America First policy that people voted him in office to undertake. And I think that's really, him using that big stage in order to put a real fine point on that, or maybe a blunt point on that.
Like Paz, I was thinking of other people when I listened to this, and I thought of JFK's inaugural address in 1961. We will pay any price, bear any burden, and to have a sense of how far we've come. That kind of Cold Warrior ethic that JFK nobly exemplified in many ways is passé today, and I think we've learned to move beyond it. But the idea of our role in the world, it's not just the old-style American foreign policy. It's the idea of American exceptionalism. Okay, took a dive at the UN yesterday. The idea that we have a special place in the world to lead by moral example, and that there's something unique about this country. It's always been a dangerous idea, but I don't know that anyone was thinking at the Trump White House about the degree to which they were slitting its throat. I want to just make two quick points here, one of which is, number one, if the lesson of the first part of this century has been that our standing armies can no longer keep us safe. If the first lesson is that all this money we spend on defense, as we just enacted under the defense budget in this country, we're spending it on stuff that doesn't keep us safe. I wish there were some Democrat or anybody who would get up and make this point so that we understand it. I realize that Connecticut regards itself as the arsenal of democracy and that we have a lot of defense contractors here, and it's been a very difficult issue for our own people. But we are pouring money into armaments that only inflame our opponents. And the second thing is, there's nothing wrong with the idea of exporting democracy. One of our problems is the people who export it don't even know what it is. They told the Russians to deregulate everything, privatize everything, slash all their budgets, destroy their social contract.
Privatizing stuff in Russia has really worked well.
And it created the greatest thugocracy in the modern history of the world. America needs to come to terms with the fact that we export more corruption than democracy. The problem with Putin is not his tanks, it's his banks that threaten not just the United States, but democracy itself. And there's someone on our side. It is time to stand up and redefine what it means to make us safe and redefine what it means to be a citizen in the world. One of the reasons Trump gets away with this to the extent he does is that he's operating in a vacuum.
I just have to say, we were talking about people that speech reminded us of during his trip to the UN. Donald Trump spent some time urging world leaders to help restore democracy and political freedoms in Venezuela. It made me think of the speech now about 11 years ago that Hugo Chavez gave in front of the United Nations, in which he called George W. Bush the devil and spoke of the smell of brimstone from. And I remember thinking, that's the last time I heard a speech quite like that at the United Nations. And I guess we're back once again.
Yeah.
Well,
Trump's speech sure set off a lot of memories for everyone.
It really did.
Yeah, really.
Trip down memory lane.
Yeah, trip down memory lane.
Well, speaking of trips down memory lane, it's not so terribly long ago that we thought that the idea of a repeal and replace of Obamacare was absolutely 100% dead. And now all of a sudden, back from the ashes comes the Graham-Cassidy bill, or the Cassidy-Graham bill, which Democrats are saying could end health care for millions. Here's Chris Murphy. He took to Facebook Live with Cory Booker to talk about what he sees as the problems with this plan.
We listened to Republicans and our president tell us the promises that they were going to make to the American people when they entered into this healthcare reform debate. They acknowledged that there were really important things in the Affordable Care Act that people liked. And they said, listen, we want to rearrange the way that the federal government interacts with the healthcare system, but we're going to make sure that everybody has coverage today, gets to keep it. We're going to make sure, absolutely make sure, that nobody's discriminated against because they are sick. We are not going to come after Medicaid, which is what the president said over and over again during the campaign. And they violated every single one of those promises.
From what we can tell, Paz, this plan does basically deconstruct Medicaid. It sends the money from the Affordable Care Act out to the states so they can run their own programs. It's gotten a lot of opposition from governors, a bipartisan group of governors, Republicans and Democrats, who both think that this is a plan that will put them squarely in the crosshairs. I mean, as we look at it from here, and we already have so many of our own problems in managing health care here at the state level, what do you see in this Graham-Cassidy bill?
You see nothing but trouble. There's a lot of attention. The Centers for Budget and Public Policy Priorities, I'm sure I mangled that. They had their first take on this. And, there's kind of a time bomb that's built into it, which in 2027, that's when there would be an overall cap, a per capita cap on what the states would get. And in 2027, by their estimation, Connecticut would lose $4 billion. And, folks, we got a $20 billion budget. The other line that was intriguing, and I have not been able to suss out yet, is there are references to limiting the ability to tax Medicaid. Now, Connecticut, is part of its creative budgeting, has gone down this road. You tax the hospitals on Medicaid, you leverage federal dollars. From a public policy point of view, this has kind of been a dodgy thing for years, but it has been allowed. So the question is, on top of losing just straight up eventually $4 billion a year in Medicaid money, does this blow up the ability of the state of Connecticut to do this kind of tax gimmick to leverage more federal dollars as well.
And this specific tax gimmick was part of this entire plan that we're going to get into in just a little bit. Christine, this is one of the things that's going to help balance the budget.
Yeah, and so this is actually really important. So the hospital provider tax, if they're not able to get this budget passed and that approved by October 1st, their ability to make it retroactive to July so that we can, start collecting some of this money it blows up. It's gone.
So this very provision at risk, and obviously, Bill, you see some other things that are at risk here as well in this Graham-Cassidy bill, which just needs barely the 50 votes that the Republicans might have right now in the Senate.
The Republicans present this thing. They position it as handing over more authority to the states on how the money is to be spent. What they're actually fobbing off on the states is the responsibility for raising the money. They are canceling the federal support for programs that provide health insurance to tens of millions of Americans and telling the states, and while we're in one of the worst shapes, we're not all that, we're not way off an outlier here in this. They're telling all these states, you come up with the dough. Well, they're not going to because they can't. And that's what's really going on in this bill.
Well, I find what's worse is that, Senator Alexander last night was like bipartisan deal that, we were working towards is done.
Yeah.
Well, we don't have the support for that, So we've given up actually going the regular course of how things work.
It would Lamar, be it used to work.
Yeah, Alexander and Patty Murray of Washington and Democrat were trying to come up with legislation that would stabilize the marketplaces, which is one of the big problems with Obamacare. I mean, some of these things are pretty rickety, although in the last round in Connecticut, there was some availability, which was, good to see. But, this is, Bill Cassidy of Louisiana is one of the authors of this new bill. And, he's an interesting guy. He's a physician who specialized in diseases of the liver. And I'm tempted to insert the New Orleans, Louisiana joke here because that's he represents Louisiana. But in any event, he's also a member of, and believe it or not, this exists, the Congressional Transparency Caucus. So I'm sure that he's going to make sure that we all know what.
No one even knows who's in it. Go ahead.
He's also a member of the Zoo and Aquarium Caucus and the Rice Caucus.
I
do my homework.
There's
people.
a zoo and aquarium caucus.
I'm bringing something.
I just want to point a couple of things about. First of all, the Lamar Alexander Patty Murray bill is horrible, and I know it's a short-term fix. To stabilize the exchanges means gives the insurance companies more money. Okay, they just increase the amount of money for the insurance companies, and simply subsidizing the cost without finding a strategy for containing the cost is at the heart of what's wrong with Obamacare and everything that we've done.
But you have to do something before.
I understand. It's not I'd vote for it if I were sitting there for the next 12 months. But I just want to make clear that that's just like sticking your finger in a dike. That buys you 12 months to fiddle around. This thing never goes away until we get to the systemic reform. And the problem, I want to shout out to Dick Blumenthal for endorsing the single-payer bill. I want to point out that a robust public option, meaning self-funded and self-administered, is the road, I believe, possibly the only road to a system that is like single-payer.
Thanks, Joe Lieberman.
But yeah, I know Joe Lieberman, who gave us the Iraq War and our current healthcare system. But truly more than any other living American, and arguably. But the fact of the matter is simple, and that is we have to reduce the role of the private insurers. Number one, in order to get a handle on this, we spend a third of our money on overhead. The next most expensive country in overhead is Canada at 16 cents. The Europeans do it for 10. They're close to a nickel in Asia. It accounts for the entire disparity. You can take the entire disparity in cost between the United States and the rest of the developed world in overhead and drug prices. I proposed this years ago in Connecticut. I'm very proud to say we fought for it for a long time. And no matter how you nuance your expression of your position, You have to take all this money this is a nation of middlemen, not entrepreneurs now. They are toll collectors. They are not adding value. They're taking 20 cents out of money and putting 5 cents of value back in.
What all do you see in this plan? And again, Bernie Sanders, famously leading this effort now that Dick Blumenthal is signing on to. I mean, is this the single-payer bill that America needs right now? Is Bernie Sanders the face to deliver this?
Yeah, well, first of all, he's more popular than anyone else in the Senate, so why not? Just so we're all clear, just so that the discussion is data-driven. And the reason he's more popular is that single payer is more popular. It's the most popular bill on the table. And so let's look at it. You've got the most popular politician proposing the most popular bill and the only one that's been proven to work anywhere else in the world. And what is the discussion of it within mainstream media? That it is the outlier, that it's some kind of outlandish idea, that American exceptionalism means that we're the only country that can't do what everybody else is doing. And it's destroying our economy, that our small businesses and large manufacturers alike have to carry this burden into every equation. Is stunning to me.
I just have to. Well, go ahead, Paz.
I just want to point out that we're several blocks away from 6,000 jobs at Aetna that rely on this stuff, and that's obviously one of the complications. I mean, to single payer, there's obviously a lot to be said for it as a way to deliver health care. There are consequences of going down that road, and some of those consequences will be felt pretty heavily in Hartford, Connecticut, and elsewhere in Connecticut.
I would just like to say that there were a lot of jobs at Pfizer, and they moved, and Aetna's moving its jobs out already, and we've been losing these jobs every single year for the last decade. And so just make sure when you make that argument that you're just talking about slowing down the outward flow of the jobs. You're not talking about any guarantee of retention. We'd be much better off.
We could have had sustenance. As a state of Connecticut, we could
Absolutely.
have done this on our own without the federal government's help, and we didn't.
Absolutely. And by the way, some of that, and not all of that moves, not all of that employment moves. Some of it moves into the new system. In our current state employee contract, the proposal I made way back when is that we open up the state employee health care contract on a voluntary basis to whatever small businesses and nonprofits want to join. You could drop their premiums by 20%, which is what Obamacare promised to do and didn't do. The reason is that we get a much better deal. If you do privatize out to one of the companies some of the work, they do it for a fairer price because you have more market clout. It's that simple.
I want to take a break because when we come back, we're going to really hear what's been happening at the state capitol over the course of the last couple of days. Mark Pazniokis and Christine Stewart have been spending very long hours trying to suss that out for us. Paz is from the Connecticut Mirror. Christine Stewart is from ctnewsjunkie.com. You just heard from Bill Curry, our Democratic political analyst, who is sitting in for Colin McEnroe this week in the Wheelhouse here on WNPR. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. We're talking about the week's news with Christine Stewart, who's editor-in-chief of ctnewsjunkie.com. Mark Pazniokis is Capitol Bureau Chief at the Connecticut Mirror, Connecticut Mirror or ctmirror.org. And also Bill Curry, our Democratic political analyst, who's sitting in for Colin McEnroe. Colin is off gallivanting around Belfast, and so you can listen to Kyone Wolf guest hosting the Colin McEnroe show this afternoon at 1 o'clock. So that should be fun. We're going to turn to some things at the state capitol.
On acid.
But I want to quickly get to Jim in Bloomfield. Hey, Jim, go ahead.
Good morning. I just wanted to make sort of a connective tissue point here. Earlier, Bill Curry was discussing the billions that we throw into the militarism in this country, armaments and things that I think he quite accurately pointed out do not make us any safer, but actually exacerbate problems. And then a few minutes ago, there was a comment about the 6,000 jobs that I'm assuming we're referring to Aetna that are linked to the healthcare industry in this country. And the connective point is transition economy. Nobody is thinking about how we transition ourselves out of those situations into something that just doesn't throw hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people on the street and out of jobs. But it has to be done for the future of our nation. And I really, frankly, at the state level nor at the national level do I hear anyone talking about how do we move forward in a transition economy so that we're not permanently stuck in these situations.
Bill, or Jim, excuse me, thank you so much for that. And I have to say, he raises a lot of good points there that I think sort of tie us into the next bit of the conversation. But, Christine, we are constantly hearing about jobs leaving Connecticut and our attempt to keep jobs. Later on, we'll probably talk about a desire to build by some a new casino in Bridgeport. Those would be jobs that we'd have for a while because we want to make sure that casino jobs don't go someplace else in the country. We talk about a changing or failing insurance system. We want to maintain those jobs. Even when we mention Pfizer, I mean, so many U.S. politicians are kind of going after the pharmaceutical industry for some of its practices. We want to keep those jobs here. I think what Jim's talking about is a whole lot of jobs that we want to keep, but those might not be the jobs that we are going to need to have, or those jobs might really, really change in 10 or 20 years, and we're not really talking about that much at all.
Yeah, so the state of Connecticut has grown 6,000 payroll jobs this year. Obviously, we want to attract and retain business. Today, all the cities and towns are submitting their proposals to make sure that the state submits the best Amazon H2Q proposal and that we could get Amazon here. I think that there's an acknowledgement that we haven't invested enough in our urban centers to attract the millennials at the moment, who are the ones who are going to be creating jobs and obtaining jobs, and we haven't done enough to improve our infrastructure in order to get some businesses here. And
staying here and building lives and buying houses, paths, and all the things that we would hope to have, not just for the short term, but for the long term.
Yeah, and I mean, Christine rightly talks about the shift, from the suburban office park that Connecticut profited from, drawing away all these companies from New York, people who were afraid of crime. And now the shift is back. But there is evidence of a countervailing trend, which is in some of these metro areas, the price of housing has become a brake on the economy. Mm-hmm. And, you see that in Silicon Valley. There was a story I read the other day that San Jose may have topped out as to what they can attract in jobs because of the cost of living. So as Amazon looks around for a place to go, I mean, that presumably will be a factor. Will that rule out Stamford, Connecticut, which fits many of the things on their checklist, but the price of housing may argue against. They're looking at places in Texas. They're looking in Denver, although Denver itself is become a go-go place where housing is going up.
But as we've said, Bill, it hasn't really stopped companies moving from Connecticut to these higher cost of living places. I mean, when General Electric picks up and moves to Boston, it's not because they want their employees to be able to afford to live someplace. I mean, my goodness, Greater Boston, especially that seaport area, is one of the most booming housing markets anywhere in the world right now.
The more they raise the taxes, the more companies go there. And, first of all, it's just something to understand. Again, Governor Malloy ran on a number of ideas that he didn't govern on, which have helped bring us to the point that we're at. And one of them was that we would give up this sort of corporate bribery-driven economic development strategy and replace it with one which is driven by the development of conditions that favor small businesses. And that's the key distinction to be made, and that's where we should be going moving forward. I just want to relate this back to the start of the question, which is I got an email yesterday from my beloved and much revered friend Marta Daniels from Chester, who was the coordinator of the Nuclear Freeze campaign in this state at its height and still an activist. And they did a lot of work on economic conversion, and it's persuasive work. If you ever just get by the labels and take a look at it even now, we have to have a strategy for how we prosper in a sane society. And, to say that we are so mortgaged to the broken healthcare and defense systems in this country that our political leaders can't be for change is a non-starter when you think about it. It defies logic in our own basic values. And so, one, there's an economic conversion. There are economic conversions ideas that are on the table that need to be developed. And the second thing is it just reminds me that again to the UN speech, we need a peace movement in this country. And I know this is off point now, but it would be great to see the Congress come up and have a statute passed on no first use, that a president does not have the authority to launch a nuclear strike except in defense of the country. And lastly, on Connecticut, I just want to repeat what I've said before. Our state's not broken. Our state government is broken. Our economy is not broken. Our democracy is broken. And if we can make the kinds of changes in public policy that we need to make, these are all solvable. Every one of these problems is solvable.
Bill Curry is sitting in for Colin McEnroe. That he provided what we in the radio business call a segue directly to what we're going to talk about next. With,
I do it all for you, John.
With Mark Paziokis and Christine Stewart.
No, really,
And so maybe we can just do this as a little bit of a play-by-play here, because there's so much to tackle about what has happened at the state capitol. I'll start with you, Paz, but I want to go back and forth with you and Christine and sort of lay out exactly what happened. So basically, we're months behind on a state budget. There's been almost no work done on the budget for long periods of time. And then there's this flurry of activity, and all of a sudden we see a GOP proposal, a Republican proposal, actually get voted out of both houses of the legislature with some substantial help from Democratic lawmakers, all while we know that the governor is going to veto any GOP plan. I think I have that more or less right, but take us through a little bit about the most interesting things about all this that we should be watching for, Paz.
Well, I'm a political guy, so I'll start with the politics. As we sit here, we don't know who, if anyone, has a working majority in either chamber of the General Assembly on fiscal issues. That was the dramatic takeaway from the vote in the Senate Friday night and in the House early Saturday morning. There is very little that is new under the sun when it comes to how you try to massage a bad budget. This was new. You had 3 Democratic senators in the 18-18 evenly divided Senate go south. And they said, no, we cannot abide by what's in the Democratic budget. They signed on with the Democrats, not only to block the Democratic
Republicans, yep.
Right, not only to block the Democratic budget, but to pass the Republican one, send it to the House, where a half dozen Democrats said same thing, signed on. So they sent it to the governor. Nobody believes this will be signed into law. And, and the other thing that was jarring about this was the reversal of roles. So the minority party, generally the Republicans in this state for a long, long time, they always say the budget comes fast. Nobody knows exactly what's in it. It's loaded with gimmicks. Well, you flipped it, and that was the Democratic message. So what we have seen since Friday and Saturday is a slow rollout of analysis and criticisms of what is in the Republican budget. UConn in particular, and there's disagreement as to what it does. The Republicans say the cut to UConn is like, $180 million. The Office of Fiscal Analysis and UConn itself says it's anywhere from $280 to maybe $300 million. So that's what's going on now. You have quite a bit of chaos. You have people trying to figure out the politics. Now, obviously, a lot rests on the governor's veto, which is certain to come, and how you position it going forward. Do the Senate Republicans stay at the table? Len Fasano, their leader, I think clearly does. House Republicans, Themis Klarides, their leader, has been very wary of really being part of a final budget solution, although, she insists she does.
I just have to say, Christine, the politics, I think, that are driving this for a lot of people, though, come out of those details or lack of details. I mean, I'm watching a hashtag of Save UConn, right? Like my goodness, that UConn is going to close down. It's going to shutter up its doors if this budget goes through, which, of course, as Paz says, it's not reality. But these tend to then be the talking points for people as we come out of a very unclear situation. So what do you see in all this?
So nobody expected the Republican budget to pass, so nobody looked at what was in the Republican budget. So that is what is exactly
Republicans.
Well, yeah. Well, that's what's going on now. And let's be honest, neither the Democratic or the Republican budget actually gets us anywhere in the future, because in the future, in both budgets, there's deficits. So the disturbing part about this, though, is if the message was, Lonnie Reed said during the debate, she's like, I hate this amendment. I hate our amendment. I hate the governor's bill. And I think most of us feel that way. But this is where we are because there's not enough money. So there's not enough money. But they have to get in a room, and they have to, in a bipartisan way, figure this out. The problem is it's been 5 days. They have not gotten into a room. They have not gotten together. Instead, today, we're off having press conferences all over the state, criticizing one budget or another budget. So they haven't come together. October 1st is upon us. And
well, we keep hearing about October 1st, Christine. So tell us a little bit about that deadline and what exactly it means, because in some ways it's being treated as a very, very hard deadline. Then we hear, Matt Ritter saying, well, it's not really, we'll get something done. It doesn't really matter. And I think to myself, my goodness, well, it seems as though October 1st triggers an awful lot of bad for the state. Am I wrong about that?
Well, okay, so October 1st was set as a deadline so that the governor could, if things go south, give money to the city of Hartford, give them at least their ECS share for this year so that they wouldn't have to file for bankruptcy. So that's kind of why it existed. Also, the tax plan for the hospitals is now structured on this October 1st deadline. So it is sort of it's more than a soft deadline. And I think that there are some other vacation schedules of lawmakers who had, October 1st kind of interferes with.
This is the sound of my head hitting the microphone. Here we go. So we're worried about vacation schedules. 5 days since all this drama the other day passed, and they're not back in a room doing this bipartisan thing they were supposed to be doing?
They're not. There's no evidence of progress. There's no evidence of serious discussion. And again, we're in the period of people trying to figure out what exactly the Republican budget that was passed by both houses would do. And again, is it a real framework to go forward, or do they have to start from scratch?
Well, a quick thing before I turn to Bill for some analysis on this, though. I mean, what are the things that you know of, both of you, in the Republican budget that might have gotten these Democrats to come over to the other side, Christine? I mean, what's the substantive difference between what the Republicans are trying to do and what the Democratic budget was set to do that got these Democrats to say, this is what we want to sign on to?
I think it was more of a statement that we don't like the Democratic budget than a statement that the Republican budget is exactly the way to go. So I think the Democratic budget had a bunch of, fees and surcharges and things that they were stuck in there at the last minute just to make it balance. And I think it was rank and file lawmakers saying you can't do that.
The Republican budget puts pressure on changing collective bargaining. It makes certain assumptions about how you would approach retirement costs, although they are highly debatable as to whether their numbers would work. Governor Malloy the other day put out an analysis that said that this would be another example of the state of Connecticut deferring major pension costs, which, of course, is one of the major drivers that put us where we are. We all are looking at whether that's true, or it is certainly partially true. The question is, what is the extent that this would worsen the state's unfunded pension liabilities and worsen situations in the out years, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, which is the whole struggle they've been having the last couple of years, is to how to responsibly deal with the future while you're also trying to balance a budget today.
Oh, the structural change. Structural change is in neither of these budget proposals. So neither of these budget proposals get the state of Connecticut on the right path and out of deficit in years to come.
In years to come, and that's structural change, and that's down the road. But you're even talking about in the near term, we're talking about budgets on both sides that are out of balance very, very quickly. I mean, this
by 2020, they'd be out of balance.
By 2020, out of balance. So it's not even like we're talking about structural down the road. Perhaps, Bill, I mean, we started the program saying that the nuclear war is imminent. Maybe that's what Democrats and Republicans are thinking about. We won't be here in 5 years to worry about any of this.
I don't want Donald Trump to finish out his term, but I'd like to finish out my own. And, a lot of us are taking this stuff very seriously these days. I want to just say a couple things about the question to Christine about, what are the differences? And this is hard stuff to swim through. But one, the Republicans in some ways were easier on cities and towns on the transfer of the pension obligation and teachers' pension obligation most. Yeah. And secondly, they were, oddly enough, for the developmentally disabled and for others of the most vulnerable and exposed members of our society, most in need of our help. And this isn't entirely true, but in many cases they actually went easier in those areas.
And they cut UConn so that they could help fund
correct.
Those areas.
And so employee benefits and higher education were where they went for the money in part. They aren't as much different on taxes. They have fewer egregious sounding taxes, but the bulk of it, the hospital tax fee, blah, blah, whatever you want to call it, formula, they couldn't avoid. So I just want to say a couple of things. One, if you step back, that's the difference, and the human services difference and for the most distressed towns, the cities and towns difference, that's not a difference that Democrats ought to be tolerating. That's just not a difference they should be tolerating for their political short-term well-being. If they don't have a higher moral view of this, or a strategic view of their political economy, for their own survival, they ought to think hard about that. And the second thing I want to observe is that a couple of things you don't hear in this debate. I've got 20 of these, but I'm just going to do two. One is the phrase health care. And you would think that pensions were 90% of our budget. But health care programmatically is half again what the pensions are, and the benefit costs push it well past that. And we aren't even close to getting the health care savings. And it goes back to, I won't repeat the earlier conversation, but if as the Office of Management Budget at the federal level, the Congressional Budget Office, the Bowles-Simpson Commission, as my own studies here all those years ago as comptroller showed, we have to restructure this system as I first proposed in 1991 and Malloy promised when he first ran for governor. Without systemic health care reform, there is no. That is the 500-pound gorilla. Health care spending is the 500-pound gorilla in the state budget. And without health care reform, you go nowhere.
Okay, so maybe that's a 500-pound gorilla, but as we heard your colleague Keith Fannis tell Lucy Nalpathanchel on Where We Live earlier this week, Paz, I mean, there's also another gorilla. Maybe it's a 300-pound gorilla, but this gorilla is the amount of debt we're already in as a state. I mean, our ability to gimmick and trick and borrow our way out, I mean, we're facing about a third of a budget that is just debt service.
Absolutely. But I want to briefly go back to something you said about how the Republican budget is better to the cities and towns. And that is, depending on your point of view. Now, we've been talking about structural change, and I'm sure many of your listeners always say, what the hell do people mean by structural change? Well, here's a real example. Every time Connecticut tries to actually distribute education funds according to a formula that gives money out on the basis of actual need, it's stopped by politics. And the reason is this principle of hold harmless. And there should be, hosannas whenever anyone at the Capitol says,
I bowed my head.
Absolutely. All that means is if you go to a formula that actually gives money where it goes, hold harmless means you will not take money away from communities that don't need it as much. And the problem with that is in a year like today, if you're trying to put the money where it is needed most, where a Superior Court judge has said, hey, folks, you got to pay attention to this.
That's right.
In a year when you don't have the extra money to hold everyone harmless, that's a problem. There are winners and losers, and Connecticut's politics are as parochial as any place in the United States of America.
And they get more parochial the longer we're in a special session versus a regular session.
So you blow away, calls for structural thing because, my town's going to lose money. And that's part of the deadlock here.
So where does the governor come into all this? Because we just have a minute before we have to take a break. I mean, the governor said he's going to veto this plan. We're not getting people back at the table. We're up against this October 1st deadline. We've got, of course, people's vacations to take into account because that's very important. I mean, Christine, where exactly do we end up next? What happens?
I think that they are still talking about getting together later on this week at some point. But I'm not, there's no clear date set, and I'm not really confident, that they're going to get there.
This is like Bill and I saying, we should get together for drinks sometime this summer. It'll eventually happen.
They closed Chatterley's. Okay, so I was deeply disappointed. Look, there's so much going on here. One, the size of the problem is, I went around this state for my entire political career telling people we're in a tremendous fiscal crisis, and it turns out I couldn't even imagine what real fiscal crisis looked like. This is one. Secondly, throughout the United States and here as well, both political parties are running on the same slogan, we're not them. And everything is cast in that sort of Manichaean black and white and highly partisan and highly ideological terms, which makes it very hard. Thirdly, the Republicans smell blood. And they know that the Malloy administration is not well thought of by your average voter. They saw what they did.
No.
Yeah, Mark. I know. Mark, and they say you cover politics. This shouldn't come as such a surprise to you. And I had conversations with some progressive legislators earlier in this session, and I said to them that I thought it was the Democrats' last chance. The session was to distance themselves from Malloy before the 2018 race really got going, and they squandered that opportunity, to say the least. And because they couldn't break out from their own, the lousy chain of inherited.
They deferred to him on a lot of issues.
That's right. The lousy chain of inherited habit, the closed leadership style, the lack of transparency in the Democratic leadership, all of that just poisoned the well here and put them in a very tough situation.
And I guess I just wonder quickly, Paz, why a deferral to a lame duck governor? I mean, this is one of the unusual things here. We have a governor who, again, he has said he's not running once again. If anybody's going to take the leadership reins at the state capitol.
It's an easy answer, because he's willing to lead. You can dislike and disagree with where he wants to go.
Yep.
I'm not saying that. But he's the guy who is, willing to set a direction. He tried to, at a pivotal point, he compromised on his budget, put his shoulder with, the House and Senate Democrats, and tried to get this done. It failed. But that's why governors always have an edge over legislators.
Well, we're going to turn to one last story here. We've got a big city mayor, Joe Ganim, who's pitching a new idea. It's actually an old idea, a casino in Bridgeport that might ride to the rescue for a whole bunch of reasons. We're going to see how real that is with Mark Pazniokis of the Connecticut Mirror, Christine Stewart of CTNewsJunkie.com, and our own Democratic political analyst, Bill Curry. This is The Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse, our weekly news roundtable, talking with Bill Curry, Mark Pazniokis, and Christine Stewart. So much to talk about this week. So we're almost rolling under the radar about news about a Bridgeport casino plan that Joe Ganim has, the mayor of the city of Bridgeport. This all comes in part because it seems, Paz, as though this plan north of Hartford is maybe permanently stalled. What's going on with the casinos?
Well, I wouldn't call it permanently stalled, but it is certainly stalled for the moment. The Department of Interior has been asked. Okay, real quick summary. Connecticut General Assembly and the governor agreed to this new casino in East Windsor, but they wanted a rock-solid guarantee from the Department of the Interior that the state's existing deal with the tribes, which produces $260 million a year in slots revenue in exchange for an exclusivity deal, would not blow up. Reasonable precaution. Let's make sure we don't add our $260 million hole to our problems. Okay. They send the appropriate paperwork to the Department of Interior, which, by the way, for months has been saying, no problem, this will be fine.
It's all good.
All of a sudden, a letter arrives that neither approves nor rejects the amendment to the gaming compacts between the state of Connecticut and the tribes. And everybody is going, what the hell? Now, if the Department of the Interior does not act within 45 days, it's deemed approved, except the compact changes must be consistent with the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. And how do you find out if it's consistent with the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act? The Department of the Interior is supposed to tell you.
Yeah.
And they have.
So that's where the East Windsor Casino is. They're trying to figure out nobody's seen a letter like this. So wait a minute, but one more point. This weird letter comes out on the eve, drum roll here, of MGM proposing the rescue, a new casino in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And I am sure this is a total coincidence.
It's a complete coincidence.
Don't ever change. I love that youthful idea.
Well, so what could happen is the General Assembly could come back and try to pass legislation. The problem with that is that in order to get the legislation over the finish line in the first place, they needed the New Haven and the Bridgeport delegation to vote in favor of this East Windsor casino. Now that this Bridgeport MGM casino exists, they might not be so willing to vote for.
Might not?
Probably won't be willing to vote for that East Windsor casino now. So
this is a chess game we have witnessed between MGM and the tribes.
Yeah.
And this was, I got to say, just as a political move, this was brilliant because so I doubt they could go that route but they would have to give up their rock solid guarantee and then be subject to the Department of Interior at some point going, hey guys, You know.
I guess I'm not surprised, perhaps, that the Trump administration, Department of Interior, might keep Dan Malloy from getting something that he wants in the state of Connecticut. Bill, last 20 seconds?
Just say one, gaming industry in Bridgeport, what could possibly go wrong? When I ran for governor in 2002, business leaders all across Fairfield County told me the reason that the great economic expansion didn't expand to Bridgeport was corruption in the city and the fact that it might take a casino, which would overtax all of its infrastructure. And imagine if we were proposing the Amazon development and putting a subsidized housing piece to it instead. Lastly, those jobs are going to come away from Ledyard. They're going to come from East Windsor. That is not a net increase.
They're going to put the Amazon thing right next to the casino. It's going to be a win-win for everyone.
Yeah.
Bill Curry, Mark
you,
Pasniokos of The Mirror, Christine Stewart from CTNewsJunkie.com. Thanks to Katie Tolarski, who produces The Wheelhouse here on WNPR.